Hi, everybody. My name is Allison Blais Palmer, and I'm the director for the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all here. We're really glad to have such a big interest in this topic, and we're really looking forward to this evening and sharing all of the wonderful information that Dr. Nevin Cohen has to share with us tonight. What I'd like to do also is to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and also to give you a bit of background about the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems. We were founded in 2013, and we're here with our vision to conduct research on sustainable food systems, and part of that is really research that's grounded in practice and in communities, and you're going to hear a lot about that tonight with the work that Nevin has done. It's very much reflective of the communities that he works with in New York. We see that food systems are levers, really important levers for change and transformation. We're facing a lot of issues in terms of social injustice and inequity. We're also obviously facing huge climate change pressures, and food is a great way of addressing those ways in those challenges in a systems kind of way. And the center is a place where we bring together researchers from across Canada. We have 7 research nodes across Canada, but we also bring together international researchers around different topics, one of which is sustainable food systems indicators. And we've been relying on Nevin's work to help inform what we're doing here in Canada. So what I'd like to do now is just take a couple of minutes to introduce Nevin. He's an associate professor at City University, New York, in the Graduate School of Public Health, and he's also the research director of CUNY's Urban Food Policy Institute. His scholarship explores the policies, governance systems, practices, and infrastructure to support socially just, healthy, ecologically resilient, and economically viable urban and regional food systems. So all of the work that he does is very much in keeping with the principles that we have at the center. His current projects include, and there's a very long list, a 5-country analysis of urban agriculture research on food retail access. Other research on food retail access, a study on the intersections of zoning, planning, and food gentrification, the effects of social equity policy on food systems, and an evaluation of the effects of urban farms in New York City Housing Authority developments. Dr. Cohen is the co-author of a recently published book, Beyond the Kale, which I just love that title. It's awesome. Urban Agriculture and Social Justice Activism in New York, that was published by the University of Georgia Press, that examines the potential of urban farms and gardens, so how you can grow food in the cities to address racial, gender, and class oppression. He has a PhD in urban planning and policy development from Rutgers, and a master's in city and regional planning from Berkeley, and a BA from Cornell. So we're really delighted to be able to bring him here, and we look forward to hearing from him. So please help me welcome Dr. Cohen.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be here and to see everybody come out for an evening to talk about metrics. It's almost like people coming out to talk about home budgeting or rebalancing your retirement plan or something like that. No, I'm actually very excited about food metrics, and I'm thrilled to be able to share some thoughts with you tonight. What I would like to talk about are a few things. One, why metrics are important and why I get excited about them, and why they're, if food is the lever for social change and environmental change, metrics are a key part of enabling food to make those changes. And then I'll talk about what I've described as the sort of 3 generational phases of food metrics, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, using the sort of internet metaphor, and then how activists and government officials can actually unearth metrics that exist and are available, but aren't being used to help us understand the food system. Those are the hidden data that is in the subtitle. So let me get started. And if you have, if I say something that's unclear or use an acronym that's crazy, you can stop me, but then we're going to try to save questions for the end to have a really lively discussion with you. So what are the effects of metrics? How do they influence policy? I think there are important things to think about as we try to think about how to use metrics strategically. Metrics are socially constructed. They're not God-given. They're really designed to explain things, and they're designed by humans. And they present particular worldviews that can be limited or distorted. We know that the GDP, for example, doesn't measure the well-being of a country, right? It's a distortion. It's a limited way to measure a concept. People construct metrics based on what they feel is important to measure, what they have the resources to measure. Sometimes it's whatever is available in front of them to actually use as a metric. Methodological conventions. So someone who's trained in GIS will see things spatially. Someone who's trained as an economist will look at the economics. Interests of those choosing the metrics. And so if it's an organization that's really focused on a particular issue, racial imbalances and injustices might be the focus of the metrics that they're concerned about. If it's a development community, it might be something like real estate prices. The desire to include or exclude certain groups from decision-making plays a part in the metrics that are chosen, whether it's metrics that are considered easily accessible or actually quite complex and only accessible to people who are trained in a particular expertise to use. Metrics can actually shape and even foreclose options for us in the future. Right? They shape the vision of the future, and in doing so, they can actually foreclose some options. So, for example, if we think about food access as access to the physical access to food, that may shape our perception of the issue and foreclose options that might include a higher minimum wage, because if we think that food access is really a poverty issue, that might be a better solution. So the choice of metrics can actually open up options or foreclose options. And often people think that because something is a datum, a quantitative piece of information, that it's actually value neutral, but in fact it's value laden. And the perception that metrics are value neutral often gives power to people who can create and convey those metrics and can do the analyses that are sometimes required to calculate metrics. Metrics in the food system are not new. We've been measuring aspects of the food system forever. The image on the left is a diagram from a book that I love that was published in 1929 called How Great Cities Are Fed by a guy named Walter Hedden, who was at the Port Authority of New York. And in 1921, there was a threat of a national railway strike in the US. And Hedden realized that because we had basically begun to use food production globally and we're sourcing food from around the world, a rail strike would really be devastating for New York City. And he began to calculate where our food came from and was the first person to come up with a number. It's 1,500 miles from farm to plate on average for food to get to New York City. And on the right is the draft version of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact monitoring framework, which is a new set of metrics and indicators that have been proposed to help track a variety of food-related issues in cities that have signed on to the Milan Food Policy Pact. How do metrics influence food systems? They measure the condition of a system. They represent the food system's characteristics. They focus attention on certain aspects of the system, whether it's equity, resilience, efficiency. They can help with evaluations and assessments of food system interventions, policies, and programs. They can facilitate communication among stakeholders, but they can also obfuscate issues. And they can raise salience, influence perception, and shape solutions. So when the Surgeon General in the 1990s in the US said that there was an obesity epidemic and gave statistics to show that obesity was rising, that focused attention on things like BMI, another metric that can be easily measured but not necessarily representative of the health effects of overweight and obesity, and not necessarily the best measure of obesity. And so metrics can raise an issue's salience or excitement in the public. What roles do they play in policymaking? They can play an instrumental role by giving data to decision makers to problem solve. They can motivate stakeholders to take action by helping them to understand problems and see potential policies and outcomes. They can be used tactically by convincing people that either things are improving on their own and don't need to be intervened with, or it can accelerate action by making the point that things are getting much worse. Sugary sweetened beverage consumption is rising, and we need to deal with that. Obesity is on the rise, we need to deal with that. Metrics can be symbols of conditions and can signify consequences that may only partly reflect reality. And in that way, they can actually help advocates build political support for their positions or help to undermine political action by advocates. So let me get more specific and give you concrete examples. I've given you sort of theoretical framework, but I want to look at 3 generations of metrics that exist in different cities. They coexist in cities, but I think it's a helpful way to understand the evolution of metrics. I call it from PDF to Street View. The Food Metrics 1.0, the sort of metrics that have been developed over the past couple of decades by cities around the world, are often curated by city agencies. City planners, food policy coordinators, food policy councils sometimes look around and see what metrics are available, what's already being collected, or what can be easily collected if we wanted to know some information, and they curate them. This is an example from New York City. On the left is the website for the Food Policy Coordinator of New York, and it's simply a list of links to different PDFs of annual food metrics reports. These metrics were required to be reported by the Food Policy Coordinator, by the City Council, which passed legislation specifying which data would be reported. And the report comes out in a 1.0 version. It's a PDF that you can download. Often 1.0 metrics are unidimensional. And so, for example, in the food metrics report, it says that since 2009, there have been 36 FRESH projects. FRESH is an acronym, food retail enhancement to support health. These are these are subsidies given to supermarkets to either expand or open in neighborhoods deemed to be to have inadequate food retail. And so these FRESH projects have been approved for either zoning or financial incentives. So 36 have been approved since 2009. What does that mean? What questions does that raise in your mind? So this is simply a unidimensional measure, an outcomes measure. But if you look and begin to map the FRESH stores that have opened compared to existing retailers, you get a slightly different picture, and questions can be raised. So this map shows the Food Bazaar supermarket, which was a FRESH store right in the center. And then I had ArcGIS draw 5-minute and 10-minute walking paths surrounding that Food Bazaar. And what you can see from this is that the FRESH store is actually surrounded by 2 grocers less than a 5-minute walk away, and another 7 grocers between 5 and 10 minutes walk away. And so it raises questions: are the FRESH stores being located in the right places? Is the designation of the areas that deserve support by this program the right areas? Are we missing the boat entirely? Are we misunderstanding what food access means? And this slide is interesting because these are Street View images of a FRESH project that was approved. On the slide, on the photograph on the top, on the right side is a new building that got a zoning density, an extra floor, because they put a FRESH supermarket on the ground floor. But by the time the building was ready to be built, and it's not, the FRESH store isn't there yet, a store opened across this, a supermarket opened across the street. And then if you look around the corner, there's a Fine Fare, another supermarket, just right around the corner. So it begins to raise the question, how do we move from unidimensional metrics that explain specific outcomes to more complex metrics that can really tell us what's going on and help us to answer bigger policy questions, like how do we measure food access? 1.0 measures tend to be output-focused, as I just mentioned. Another example is that the Food Metrics Report in New York reports that 515,000 health bucks worth more than $1 million in fruits and vegetables were distributed. So these are coupons that let people of low income get additional value, $2 or $5 additional value when they spend money at a farmer's market. But the metric is reporting the health bucks that were distributed. There's no indication of how they were spent, whether they were spent, and there's certainly anecdotal information that they're not enough of a subsidy to make it worth it for people to shift their shopping habits from a supermarket to a farmer's market, and that a lot of them are unspent. And so while they're really nice bonuses for city council members and the health department to give out, they may not be effective at changing people's diet. And there's certainly not evidence about whether using health bucks really gets people to eat more fruits and vegetables. So, and one more example, we have data that the number of SNAP recipients is 1.6 million in New York. That's a large number. That's 20% of the population that depends on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps. And that's an important metric, but it doesn't tell us what percentage of eligible people this represents. There's no denominator. It doesn't say how the rates have changed over the past decade, and if they've changed, why. Whether certain boroughs have higher rates of participation because they're more eligible people, or because there's something happening in that borough or the demographics are different. And it doesn't say what's happening at the sub-borough level and whether the borough is the right scale to analyze SNAP participation. And finally, food metrics 1.0 tend to be siloed, and one example is a listing of green thumb gardens that are in New York that the city publishes annually. And it's useful information to know where the green thumb gardens are, and there's some data on whether they produce food or not. But green thumb is only one part of the urban agriculture system in New York, and so there are probably about 600 green thumb gardens, but about 900 to maybe 1,000 urban agriculture projects throughout the city. And so choosing siloed information from one particular agency limits the value of these metrics. 2.0 food metrics are more advanced, and this is an image of the Food by Ward project in Toronto, a wonderful project. And it shows that this form of metrics are city curated, but with external updates and the possibility of people feeding information back to the city and clarifying and updating the information. It's also it's multidimensional in that using this website, you can overlay information on sociodemographics over the assets that are mapped on the map. Another example of multidimensionality is a project that we worked on for the City Council. The City Council in New York City was concerned that supermarkets were closing. Conventional supermarkets were being run out of business or closing. So we looked at not just the number of supermarkets in the city, because that's only a particular outcome, it's unidimensional, but we looked at what data can we use to explain why supermarkets might be vulnerable for leaving the city. One reason they're vulnerable is because the sites that they're located on get developed. And which sites get developed? These are called soft sites in planning jargon. These are sites where the supermarket takes up a certain amount of bulk on the land, and the zoning allows a much denser, bigger building on that site. And so what's soft is the fact that there's value to be gained by developing the site for something bigger. And so this is a map showing the concentration in numbers of supermarkets that are on soft sites by council district. Just one example of using different data to develop a multidimensional picture of a food policy issue. 2.0 metrics are outcomes focused. This is an example on the left of a metric from the Food Policy Report, Food Metrics 1.0, that shows that there were 7.3 million meals served in city schools at 1,300 locations. It's a really impressive number. It's second only to the US military in terms of institutional food served, but it doesn't tell us very much. And if you look at the Mayor's Management Report, which in New York City is the report that measures operational efficiency of different agencies, and most large cities have something equivalent, you see that the school lunch participation rate has actually been falling. And that begs the question, what's happening? Right, so Food Metrics 2.0 can help us contextualize information and help to help advocates ask questions of city officials that could help to challenge the status quo and raise questions about whether policy has to change. This example is showing that, and this is data from the Mayor's Management Report, again, showing that the three main federal food benefits in the US, SNAP, school meals, and WIC, which is a benefit for women who are pregnant or have infants, actually changed the poverty rate significantly in New York. SNAP alone by over 3%, 3 percentage points. And so that begins to tell us that it's not so important, it's not just important that there are 1.6 million people using SNAP, but that SNAP is a poverty alleviation policy. And that if we care about reducing poverty, we need to, as a city, support maintaining the integrity of the SNAP program and actually help people who qualify for SNAP but aren't participating participate. 2.0 metrics are often interactive. And this is an example from New York, but this is also replicated in most cities around the world now. This is an open data portal that provides access to a whole range of data affecting city government. There's a New York State equivalent, and the user can download this to an Excel spreadsheet and manipulate it, but also can use this website to visualize the data. And it's an opportunity to make this data more useful and interactive and have it available to a wide range of the population. So let's move on to 3.0, and I'll be moving more quickly here to cover more material. But Food Metrics 3.0 is, as you can imagine, more complex and more advanced, and is actually potentially self-curated compared to 1.0, which is typically curated by an agency. So what is a self-curated set of food metrics? It means that people can actually create apps and websites and use other tools to manipulate available public data to represent the food system in unique ways. So this is just one app that I pulled off the website. The city has had competitions to encourage web developers to create interesting visualizations of public data. And this is just the counts of different cuisine types, and it comes from the city's inspection data of restaurants, which also records the type of food served. So if you want to know what the, it's not surprising that Chinese and pizza and coffee shops are common in New York, but you can see how this kind of re-representation of public data can be used to tell lots of different stories about the food system. And one thing you can begin to do, for example, is look at the restaurant rating data to see if there are disparities in where restaurants that are graded A versus C are located in the city, or whether there's disparate enforcement of the sanitation code, because you can see the restaurants that have an incomplete grade or a pending are those that the inspector caught something and is going back to re-inspect. And you can begin to ask questions about whether the food retail system is an equitable system. 3.0 metrics are multidimensional and contextualized. So one example is a new project from the city planning department to create new types of interactive websites that address planning issues. So there's a team of planners who have been released from their desk duty at the city planning department to do the creative things. And one of the projects they came up with were these enhanced community district profiles. So these are providing basic information about land use in the community districts around New York City, but they also have flood maps, flood zone maps. And I just picked Community District 2, which is the Hunts Point neighborhood of the South Bronx. Does anyone know what Hunts Point is famous for? It's one of the world's largest wholesale food markets. And it is the central produce market for much of the deliveries to small and medium-sized supermarkets in New York City. And what else do you notice about that site? Right? It's in a flood zone. And by, 20, I can't read this one, 2050, much of the floodplain will cover the market, which is located at the point of the peninsula. And that raises questions about the resilience of the food system in New York City. And do we need to build flood walls? Do we need to insure the companies against flood loss? Do we need to relocate the Hunts Point market? How will bodegas get their food if there's another superstorm Sandy? 3.0 metrics are upstream and downstream. In public health, we talk about the upstream determinants of health as the social determinants of health. These are things like poverty and racism that make your health outcomes likely to be either positive or negative. And so when we look upstream in terms of food metrics, what do we look for? One example is a project from MIT called the Living Wage Project that tries to estimate the actual cost of living in cities around the US, including for food. And so what we see from the data on New York is that the living wage to pay for food for your family is about $17.50. And of course, the minimum wage is going up, but it's still around $11. And that data can arm labor activists to fight for not just a $15 minimum wage, but something higher. And it can raise questions about whether the social wage, in other words, federal benefits like SNAP and WIC, need to be protected to make sure that they add into the actual wages that people get paid as salary to enable people to live. And it also raises questions about whether food activists need to also be housing activists and fight for affordable housing. Right? So it begins to help us really come together around a lot of social justice issues once we're armed with information that shows us that food access is really about making enough money to pay for food and your rent in New York City. 3.0 metrics are also interactive and immersive. And the example I've been working with on a project with actually a colleague from the University of Toronto, he's a PhD student. We've been looking at food data in the Bronx from 2007 to 2017-18. What we're interested in is whether food gentrification has occurred in the Bronx. If some of you may have heard that term, it's gaining salience now, but it's simply the change in the food environment that results from development, increased property values, greater affluence, and potentially displacement of commercial establishments and residential dwellers in neighborhoods as they gentrify. And it also means things like changes in the type of food sold in a neighborhood. So a supermarket could be there, but they can suddenly start to change what they're selling to appeal to more affluent, younger, newer residents. And suddenly people who've lived there a long time don't feel like they're welcome in the supermarket or there's food for them here. So this is using Google as a way to Google truth the data. And it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek term, but there's a lot of research on the messiness of public data. And if you've used any kind of large public data sets, you know how messy it can be. And ground truthing is the way to really test whether that data is accurate. And many people have ground truthed food retail data to really understand the distribution of supermarkets, for example, in a community. You can't do that for longitudinal historical data, but Google has a really neat feature where you can slide the date back to a previous year, and they now have 10 years of street photographs that you can look at. And so this example shows the change from a fruit and vegetable store in 2007 in a neighborhood in the Bronx to a wine and liquor shop. And what Google also allows you to do is scan around the neighborhood and see what else is there. So just down the street used to be a small supermarket that is maybe a large bodega. But you can see that by 2018, they invested in expansion and a new banner and some upgrading. And so something is going on in this neighborhood that is encouraging the food retailers to invest in their properties. And this also suggests that measuring only physical access to supermarkets is a really limited and distorted view of food access, when in fact you need to look at the range of food retail options in a neighborhood that include a fruit and vegetable market that might be next to a really tiny supermarket that, if you only looked at the supermarket data, would seem deficient in the neighborhood. But in fact, the neighborhood might have ample opportunities to shop for healthy food. 3.0 metrics are crowdsourced. They often are built from the ground up rather than from an agency collecting data at the top down. So this is a project that I'm just beginning in cooperation with a company called SafeGraph. SafeGraph aggregates and de-identifies all of the location information that cell phones capture as you move about your daily life. And most people don't realize it, but you often have to turn off the location capture information and affirmatively say that you don't want it reported to Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. For those who don't, this is captured and SafeGraph aggregates it. And what they have is data showing for every census block group in the US, the point of origin of trips during the daytime, which are termed office or work trips, and between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m., or home trips, and the retailer that those trips wind up going to. And so this is a map of, first, all of the food retailers in the Bronx, and then all the way at the top left is a Stop and Shop that I happen to be interested in looking at. And from the SafeGraph data, these are the unique visits in the month of September 2018 from these census block groups to that Stop and Shop from home, because they're in the evening or on the weekend. Right? So you can begin to see actually how people are shopping for food. And in this case, what are the supermarkets they're passing by on their way to this Stop and Shop? And this can begin to paint a much richer picture of how people access food and what kinds of policy interventions would be more appropriate for individual neighborhoods than simply saying, well, the square footage per capita is what we consider deficient, and therefore we need a new supermarket here. We need to know what type of supermarket, where it should be located, and whether there's land available, commercial land available for the supermarket to be located there, and also how people are getting from place to place. And another question that I'm particularly interested in is our public housing population, 500,000 people living in New York City public housing, who are the poorest and people in the city and have the greatest proportion of non-communicable diseases, largely caused by diet. And so understanding where people in public housing shop is particularly important. And finally, they're globally linked. And this is an example of a project that Allison mentioned that I'm just getting underway. It's called the FEW meter, Food, Energy, Water Meter. And it's an effort by researchers in 5 cities in Poland, UK, Germany, France, and the US to engage farmers and gardeners to collect data and upload it to a global platform. This is a relational database that lives in the cloud and is going to be populated over the next 2 growing seasons with all sorts of operational data, material flow data, and we're going to be able to use this to not only share back with the farmers information about whether they're growing enough kale and being as productive in Poland as they are in Germany, but also questions about how, if urban agriculture were scaled up in these cities, it would affect the food, energy, water resources of the city, and whether we can somehow optimize urban agriculture so that those resources are optimized. So this is Food Metrics 3.0, and I want to quickly go back and explain what I think we can do to advance food metrics, no matter what gestational stage or level of sophistication a city's food metrics happen to be in. So for Food Metrics 1.0, we can begin to add denominators. And for example, in addition to knowing the number of people receiving SNAP, the city also publishes something called the Program Access Index, which looks at levels of poverty to estimate how many people would actually qualify for SNAP. So we can look at whether the ratio of qualified to recipients is close, or whether there's a big gap and the city needs to invest in outreach and other mechanisms to get people to sign up. We can provide operational data. And so if we know that the levels of SNAP participation are different in different places around the city, could this be the result of different performance at the SNAP centers where people have to sign up and re-register? So this is operational data to make sure that agencies are performing efficiently, and it's about SNAP. And almost nobody that I know of has actually ever looked at this data in comparison to, and it's much more detailed than the bar chart I showed you, in comparison to actual participation rates by neighborhood. But that can raise questions even in the Food Metrics 1.0 landscape and help advocates argue for more resources. Include causal data. So sticking with SNAP, one of the issues that we uncovered in a study of immigrant-facing organizations that help immigrants navigate various systems in the city is that the Human Resources Administration, which runs the SNAP program in New York City, translates the information into 9 languages, but according to the census, there is 17% of the population who speak languages primarily at home that aren't being translated by HRA. So it's 17% of people have some trouble probably navigating the SNAP system if they're being reached at all. And so this is a simple policy solution, right? Get more translators and translate the material. Or let's understand, who those communities, what communities there are and where they're located, and do some other kinds of outreach. Enable access to raw data. This is a great example that really makes me irritated. So the City Council required the Board of Ed, the Department of Education, to give access to cafeteria inspection data from the Department of Health. Right? So what the Department of Ed did was it created a website that requires you to type in the school name that you want information on, one by one. And there are like 1,800 schools in New York City. And so providing data in an easy format that doesn't require you to code the website and scrape the data or hire a young coder to do that is really important. And so it's about providing really, really good access to important data. And actually, the CUNY School of Journalism has a data science program now in data journalism. And they scraped this website and found that, not surprisingly, the schools with the dirtiest cafeterias are in the poorest neighborhoods. And that can arm parents. That can help parents understand why their kids don't want to eat in the cafeteria. That can tell parents, don't have your kid eat in the cafeteria and eat school lunch. It can get the parents to call the principal and find out why the janitors aren't keeping the cafeteria. You get the picture, and you can see how metrics can really arm people at the grassroots to make change. 2.0 metrics can help combine data from different agencies. And this is one that was in the B-side metrics report. We looked at, from agency performance data, how many meals are served to the elderly by city agencies, both congregate meals in senior centers and Meals on Wheels. And they're flat. But the city planning department put out a report showing that the number of seniors is growing, or is expected to grow between 2010 and 2020 by 17.5%. So there's a disconnect. And people can begin to contextualize this data and realize that either there aren't enough meals for seniors, or the demographics of seniors is changing and they don't need congregate meals, or they're getting meals somewhere else, or something is amiss. And so this is a really powerful tool by combining data from different agencies and focusing on upstream determinants of health, as I mentioned. This is data from the Department of Consumer Affairs, which is charged with receiving labor complaints under a variety of really great progressive new laws that were passed under the previous under this administration, to require paid sick leave, to require a higher minimum wage, to ensure that workers are given proper notice of their schedules. And the question is this being enforced? And this is an important upstream determinant of health in the food system because, as we know, since the Great Recession, some of the biggest job growth in cities around the global north, in North America in particular, are in the food service industry. And they're among the most low-paying jobs around. And they often employ immigrants who are the most vulnerable. And so to the extent that these jobs are vulnerable and people are being cheated out of sick leave, it has two impacts. It has an impact on whether those families can afford to feed their kids properly and whether people are working in the food industry and going to work sick because they are not being allowed to take sick days without fear of losing their job. Using platforms that enable live updates. So we've seen that the Food by Ward website has a feature that allows people to contribute data. This is a project from that planning group that I mentioned before to help people find all of the zoning and land use applications around the city. And because zoning affects where food retail can locate, because zoning affects gentrification in a neighborhood, this is a critical piece of data for food systems advocates, even though these are not directly food system data. We can begin to integrate big and small data in Food Metrics 3.0. And this is another example of the city putting online all of the active major construction projects going on in the city. Both the cost, but also more importantly for food systems advocates, square footage being built and proposed dwelling units being built. Because if we think of food access, and I think it's the wrong way to think of food access, as the proportion of food retail space per capita, then if we have more per capita, we have more people in a neighborhood, we need more supermarkets. And if the market is not going to provide additional food retail, then policymakers have to help make that happen. Or we at least need to be asking those questions as proposals go through the land use approvals process. Are we asking in environmental impact assessments? We're not, is the answer. Are we, it's a rhetorical question, are we asking whether food access is being diminished by a new development project, or is it being enhanced? Those questions are certainly on the table, could be added to environmental assessments, and, but communities need to be empowered and aware of the data to even begin to ask those questions. Food Metrics 3.0 can really contextualize the food system, and this is another example from the article of looking at not just the fact that the city 2 years ago made lunch for all students free instead of having a two-tier system where some students had to pay and some ate for free, which created all sorts of issues of stigma and made kids not want to eat in the cafeteria, to one that's universally free. But that has a different impact from community to community, and because of the fact that the kids who were paying were a little more affluent than the kids who were getting lunch for free, the neighborhoods that are benefiting from this policy are actually the middle class and a little bit more affluent neighborhoods. That's not a problem, but it's important to understand this information because what this can do is help parents become interested in, for example, tracking the extent to which the number of kids eating school lunch in the cafeteria has increased as a result of this policy, which is something that was predicted by the policy change. But we saw those numbers before that they're actually declining, so is this going to reverse that trend? And can we think of ways to get the principals and the teachers to make food part of the curriculum now that it's literally free for everyone and there's no question about kids being excluded from this part of the day? And so now there are opportunities to actually think of lunch as part of social studies and science and other parts of the curriculum. It also raises questions about Another metric which I didn't show you, which is the number, the hours in which lunch is served in every school in New York City. And in some of the overcrowded districts, lunch is being served at 10 in the morning so that kids don't want to eat at 10, don't want to eat lunch at 10 because they just had breakfast, and they get hungry at 2, and so are forced to snack on unhealthy food. 3.0 can facilitate interactive exploration of lots of different questions. This is a wonderful project. It's now defunct, but the data is still up and available. 596 acres, I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It was a project to help communities get control of vacant land in their neighborhood, whether it was privately or publicly owned. So this is a map of all of the vacant public and private parcels. And when you click through, you get advice on not just who the owner is, but then instructions on how you would go about contacting the Department of Transportation or the Housing Department to ask for control of this lot, to turn it into either a community garden or a non-food public use. And finally, we can begin to include crowdsourced data. And this is a picture of the Google camera that is used to take the Google Street Views. And it's not on a car, but it's on a backpack. And if you have a research project that could benefit from Street View, you can actually apply to Google and they'll lend you this camera for a period of time to do your research. So this can allow us to begin to capture really detailed food environment data that wouldn't be able to be captured simply through information about licenses and store ownership, but actually be able to visualize what the food landscape looks like to people who are walking down the streets and experiencing competition from vending machines and bodegas and supermarkets. And we have a project that's just getting underway on predatory marketing. And so advertisements in storefronts and on billboards for unhealthy food. And it wasn't the last one, I lied. We can use 3.0 metrics to help create global data platforms. And this is the exciting part of the project that the Milan Food Project is really opening up, the idea of cities around the world collaborating on sharing data and learning from each other and creating a community of practice that's global, mediated through data that lives on platforms that are accessible to all. And that's really grandiose, but I just want to show a modest example of my own work, and this is partly my obsessive-compulsive disorder, but I've been creating a food environment database for New York City that includes all the growers, all the retailers, all the farmers markets, all the wholesalers, et cetera. And this lives on a piece of an application, a piece of software that is cloud-based and can allow cities from around the world to begin to add information about their own food environments. And as researchers, we can begin to do analyses like, is the food retail sector changing in different cities? We certainly know from research in South Africa, for example, and in other cities in the global south that global food retailers are moving in and capitalizing on the market, in some cases displacing traditional or conventional food sellers. And who are those global actors, and what is their position and stake in a city like New York or Toronto, and are there distribution chains and are there marketing chains affecting eating habits in cities around the world? And so I'll end there, and we can begin to maybe have a dialogue about this. Thank you very much.
Wow. I thought Nevin didn't sleep before I saw this presentation. Now I'm convinced. I don't know, there must be like 3 of you or something. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Nevin. That was just amazing. And I mean, it really makes the case for how data enriches our perspective about what's happening within the food system, how it can be a lever for social activism and for eco-activism and help us deal with lots of injustices. But what I'm going to do now is introduce Barbara Emanuel, who has very kindly agreed to be here, and have a bit of a chit-chat with Nevin for a couple of minutes and ask him some questions. And just by way of introduction, Barbara Emanuel is the manager of the Toronto Food Strategy. This is led by Toronto Public Health and proposes a new vision for Toronto's food, one that integrates both health and city building. So all of your approaches are incredibly useful in that context. The intent is to build food connections across and within city divisions, between city government and community, and between multiple food system stakeholders. So obviously, you guys are going to have a lot to talk about. And that this food strategy builds on the strong foundation of the Toronto Food Policy Council, which has operated for more than 20 years. So Barbara, thank you so much for being with us and to engage in this conversation. And once Barbara and Nevin have had a chance to talk for a couple of minutes, Elaine has asked me to let everybody know that if you do ask a question, we're recording this event, and we'll be broadcasting it on our YouTube channel, so we just need you to be aware of that if you're asking a question. Okay, thanks. Over to you guys.
Well, thanks. It's a bit odd that I'm a moderator for a panel on metrics. For those that know me, I'm a metrics skeptic. I'm also a metrics pragmatist because I work in city government and I'm constantly asked to deliver metrics. Sometimes I think it's stupid and not necessarily that valuable. And sometimes it's very strategic in furthering our work. So that makes me also a qualified metrics admirer. I am a metrics, I'm an admirer of Nevin. And so I do have some pointed questions. And we'll open it up because I think everybody here will have some of those questions. So clearly, Nevin, you have demonstrated that metrics have considerable power. They enable change. They can influence or help to influence policy. And if accessible to people impacted, they can support action on the ground. At the same time, I believe that metrics can reduce complexity by reducing complex elements to numbers and forgetting the stories, forgetting the lived experience on the ground. And sometimes, and this is very much in my experience, the focus on generating these numbers, these indicators, these metrics can actually replace action on the ground. So obviously one of the solutions that's kind of what I interpreted was woven through what you presented here is that the people impacted must have agency over metrics. Okay, how? How do you do that?
Well, so in a few ways, but I want to first say that I also don't like the term metrics because it implies only quantitative information. And what we could replace it with is insight and measures. Mm-hmm. And those measures could be qualitative as well. And I think one of the things that new advances in distributed information and new technologies allows us to do is capture different types of data effectively and at scale so that we can begin to see patterns that we wouldn't be able to see through simply census data or economic information. And I think it's also important to realize that whether we care about metrics or not, they exist and they are defining our world and our food system in particular. And so as advocates, if we choose not to play the metrics game, then we risk having the system defined around us. Mm-hmm. And so to answer your question more pointedly, I think activists, ordinary citizens need to be as fluent as possible with the metrics that are being used to define the food system. They need to partner with experts who know the technology that can be used to help understand and manipulate those metrics and generate new metrics. So they could be academics, they could be other advocacy organizations, they could be the 16-year-old kid nearby who happens to be coding and has gone to coding camp who can scrape a website. But I think it requires a network of partners to really disentangle the metrics and maybe reform them in ways that tell the stories that groups really want told. And so it means maybe refocusing spatial data to show racial disparities, or looking at nutrition data and trying to identify interventions that might be more helpful in reducing sodium consumption.
Absolutely agreed. So those of us on the ground need partners like you, academic-wise. And so just take the next step in terms of translating metrics into actionable strategies and steps and policy.
I think one strategy is to sort of use metrics to ask the right questions. And I gave some examples. And so if you see that there's declining participation in a program, it's not enough to just sort of report that metric, but begin to raise questions about why and what information do we need to know to understand why this is happening, and what are policy solutions. And so I see metrics as a tool to help communities actually ask the right questions rather than allowing people in government to pose the wrong questions and answer them, because the data that they have happens to answer those questions. Other examples are in food access. I think that's a really complex phenomenon, whether people have sufficient access, whether their physical access to food affects their diets, how access is measured in different contexts. And so I think we need to have a very big open debate about what we mean by food access when we talk about food access, and move beyond the notion that proximity is the most important thing to understand how people move about their lives and make choices about what to buy. And one more final thing is that it can, I think, help us strategically to move upstream and raise questions about poverty and fairness. When we look at data on how much it costs to live in a big city, we realize that at the end of the day, food access is about not having enough money, and that means labor policy, and it means organizing with labor. And so I'll end there, but what it can also do, and I think is really exciting, is to help food activists find themselves becoming environmental activists and labor activists and activists around community open space and planning. And so once we realize that the data are all around us and they all actually affect the food system, we realize that we have to work together.
Well, food's the way into everything, most of us in this room probably believe. So, and just probing one step further with that, and then I want to open it up to folks in the audience here. You mentioned the upstream, and it seems to me that effective metrics have to support both upstream and downstream impact. So whether the upstream is a policy change or and the downstream can be impacting action on the ground and making information and data accessible at the community level. But how do you ensure that researchers collect and interpret the data so that it's meaningful for the community impacted? I mean, I think you've kind of addressed that, but I'd like a little more.
Yeah, in the book that Alison mentioned before, Beyond the Kale, we interviewed farmers and gardeners, all of whom realized that they're not going to grow enough vegetables to feed their neighborhood, and they're not going to change the nutritional outcomes of their community. But they realize that they have space and they have an activity that can mobilize people, and that's what they choose to. So the answer is that they understand the complexity and the need to consider the upstream or social determinants of their condition, and also make sure that they're registered as farmers and they are getting acknowledgement for producing food in their community and working with the Department of Health on different kinds of interventions at the ground level. I think what academics and trained activists can do is help to connect the dots, which aren't always easy to see if you're not familiar with the data and the sort of analytical methods and tools that can be used to make that data more easily understandable.
Right. So I'm going to open it up. Yeah.
This is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but do you, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but do you have any metrics to show which metrics have changed policy? And a related question is a part of the idea of metrics to make the intangible tangible, or will this always be a challenge?
That's not tongue-in-cheek. That's a legitimate question, and I appreciate that. One example that I talked about earlier is the definition of qualification for SNAP, for example. It's based on the federal poverty level, which New York City has done separate research to show is not consistent with the reality of poverty in New York City, and they've created their own poverty measure in New York City. And so what does that do? Well, the use of metrics to qualify people affects everybody who applies for SNAP, right? It's and it's a measure that has changed over time, and the reason people have stopped participating in SNAP is in part because they are moving out of poverty, and knowing whether that move out of poverty because they have a job now is actually earning them enough money to feed their family a healthy food is an important part of understanding these metrics. And coming up with alternative metrics that could show that we actually need to provide income support to people after they leave SNAP is really a valuable piece of information that activists can use. And we're fighting in the US to prevent the USDA from requiring able-bodied adults without children to basically be thrown off of SNAP. And having the data to show that these able-bodied adults without children actually use SNAP benefits in between jobs. They actually have jobs, but they don't have consistent jobs. And they're not slackers. They're not sitting at home watching TV. They're out looking for work. They're getting seasonal work, whatever. And so that's the data that activists can collect that can persuade their congressperson to change the law so USDA doesn't, by regulation, take this ability away.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you kind of had a sense of whether or not, or how these metrics were changing as it relates to, or were they changing with the changes in the way that people access food. So my mind went to the example you gave about the food gentrification, and thinking that a lot of that yuppie generation is consuming food is accessing food in a different way. They're accessing it through cyberspace, essentially. And physical distance is becoming less and less important. So, being within a 5-kilometer radius or whatever might not be as important. Are the food metrics, have you noticed an evolution in the food metrics to account for these changes?
I feel, and maybe I shouldn't say this because my training is in planning and not public health, but I feel that public health academics are always trying to fight the last war. And so we're still sort of focusing on rearranging the spatial configuration of supermarkets and what's on the shelves, when in fact, actually in a month in the US, there's going to be a national pilot rolled out to allow people with SNAP to spend their SNAP money through online grocers. So Amazon in New York City is rolling out Amazon Fresh to people in poverty and who are depending on SNAP. That will change completely the patterns of food access for poor people, as well as the more affluent people who are just gravitating to web-based systems. And so my short answer is no, we're not actually keeping up with the metrics, but we need to. And that's part of the 3.0 schema, that we need to actually look at how to measure these phenomena in nimble ways, so that as the industry changes, as the market changes, we can actually have the data in hand to know or to be able to predict what the effects will be.
Anybody else? Okay, Lori.
How do you determine what metrics your particular, how do you determine what metrics your particular organization is going to collect? Like, are you working hand in hand with a city government so that, and you'll actually know then what happens to those metrics afterwards? Is there some kind of long connection there?
At CUNY, we tend to work with activist organizations and community-based groups, and so there still is a disconnect between what the city chooses to collect and communicate, and what activists, what questions they're interested in answering, and therefore what metrics they need to have to answer those questions. My approach is to actually figure out what the right question to ask is, and then try to find the data that will answer that question, whether it's budget data or land use data. So, for example, I've been interested in this question of food access and why we're spending so much money to subsidize supermarkets when, if you do the math, it doesn't seem to make sense. And if you look at the research that other public health scholars have done on what the effect of a new supermarket in the neighborhood is on dietary patterns, it shows that there's not very much of an effect. And so, it poses the question, well, what are other ways that we can begin to measure this question of access? And then I have to look and see what data is available to figure that out. And do we have the income data? Do we know even what people at different levels of income are spending their food dollars on in New York City? We have national data, but it's not really appropriate at the local scale. So does that answer your question? It's a process of finding out what people are concerned about, finding out what questions they want answered. As an academic, thinking about how to sort of frame that question in a way that could be useful in shaping policy, and then seeking the data to answer the question.
So just as a follow-up, is that system working, do you think, or not, in terms of actually getting data for what we need for making society better?
Well, I think, give me some time. I think, no, I think that it does in certain examples. So we're seeing now that community organizations are more focused on rezonings, and the food activists in those communities are just beginning to realize that they need to say something about the food environment as their neighborhoods are rezoned. And so having data on the soft sites that supermarkets are on, or the potential impact on other commercial spaces of redevelopment, has, I think, had an impact.
I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
I have a quick question. If I were to go back home tonight and try to extract some data from a website, or let's say a medium-sized community, would you expect to find a more tabular data that you can right away try to do some analytics, or we're at a stage that you can't really expect to get that stuff relatively, low-hanging fruit?
It varies significantly, and it's even in big affluent cities, it's always messy data.
Okay.
So there's no real specific answer I can give you, but for sure you would need to have the skills to clean large data sets, which is a really technical skill.
Yeah.
All of these require technical skills of one sort or the other, mapping skills, data manipulation skills, some statistical and analytical skills. But there are partners out there and people in nonprofits and in academic institutions that can help.
Yeah. Thank you.
Jonathan. Oh, okay.
Hi. So I'm curious, is any of the data you collect reported manually? And if so, is there a margin of error there where like someone might make a mistake or misinterpret the question that they're posed? And if so, I assume you'd use like statistical software to sort of gauge that and incorporate that, but is that a challenge for you in using metrics?
It's an enormous challenge. It's labor intensive. It's, as I said, the data are messy. I just, before this presentation, I looked at the SNAP by community district data and saw, oh gee, the numbers in the Bronx look like the numbers that used to be in Manhattan. That must be a mistake, right? And I contacted the health department and they're like, oh, this was reported incorrectly. This happens all the time. And so part of the process of I think, developing consistent and usable food metrics would suggest a project that maybe we can begin here and begin with colleagues around the world to help food advocates use the tools that other analytical experts use to actually manipulate and clean large public data sets. And that's what they teach in data journalism courses, and that's what they teach when you go to Python coding camp and other places. So now I know that I'm told that students who graduate from public health schools no longer put SAS or SPSS on their CV, they put Python because that distinguishes them as knowing coding and or R, and knowing how to manipulate big data, and that's really an important skill for all of you students to get.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. My question is really about the data that exists and can't be accessed. Now, the general context for the question is increasing power, as you noted actually in your presentation, of the private sector over food systems. Clearly very dominant in cities in the global north and increasingly present in cities in the global south. And these private sector companies or chains or whatever are themselves creating huge amounts of data to which the researcher actually has a great deal of difficulty getting access. Mm-hmm. So it's a two-part question. One is, I mean, is this a problem that's just going to be always with us? And secondly, which is a sort of broader question, is does the fact that we cannot seem to get access to that kind of data actually mean that we don't really understand fundamental aspects of the open food system?
It's a great question. And thank you for raising it because I didn't cover it in the talk, but there are two things I want to answer. I'll answer the last point first, and that is it's absolutely true that the crucial data are, revenue data, profit data, market research data that is hard to get as a researcher. It's very expensive to buy. There might be ways to aggregate our resources to get that data, and there might be opportunities to require that data to be reported to government. So that's a policy question. And it's not unprecedented to require the disclosure of certain types of economic information. For example, in the U.S., there is a lawsuit that's going to the Supreme Court to require SNAP expenditure data to be available publicly by store. And that would tell us what people are buying around the country in great detail. Now, the chains know what people are buying, obviously, but having that data nationwide would be enormous. And it's actually, The lawsuit is partly hinging on the rollout of this online snap purchasing pilot, because the argument is that Amazon will gain a lot more by having data on brick and mortar retail sales than the brick and mortar stores will have on Amazon sales, which are placeless. And so there's a disparity in value, and that's a potentially unconstitutional disparity. So that's one answer. The other answer is that as these 3.0 systems are used by advocates, we have to realize that we often don't own the data. We often don't control the data. We don't control the Google Street View images. There are restrictions. Maybe I violated some restrictions by showing those images today. And we have to be involved in information access advocacy as well as food advocacy if we want to have the tools down the road to be able to change the food system. And that's a scary proposition because that's a huge area of advocacy that I'm not versed in. But intellectual property, access to these online systems, issues of privacy. Do we have privacy if our data on where we're moving around the city is captured and being used, not to help locate stores in low-income neighborhoods, but to locate, new Walmarts in neighborhoods. So I guess I don't have an answer for you specifically, but I think we need to work together to overcome those challenges.
In sort of a direct follow-up on the question, and this is actually a really unsexy funding-based question, knowing the power dynamics in the system and knowing sort of your question of like, who are asking these questions and who are these questions asked for, and I'm curious if you see a trend or an appetite amongst funders, whether they be in academic circles or elsewhere, towards a more equitable sort of like lens when it comes to metrics and accountability in this research, as well as if you like have any good examples of almost strange bedfellows of partners, like you mentioned before, working together to move this forward.
There's a huge effort in the public health world to use data more effectively. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation just issued an RFP for projects that would use big data to help reduce health inequities. There's a data advocacy to support health. DASH is the acronym organization, a network of public health practitioners who are using data. So I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of capacity being built at the grassroots in planning departments, as you saw from those experimental websites, to the buildings department, which is putting up new data, to entrepreneurs who are being given incentives by cities to build apps that use public data for the public good. New York has something called the Big Apps Competition, but cities around the country, and probably in Canada, I don't know for sure, have competitions to award money and prizes to people who develop interesting apps that use public data for solving important problems. It means geographers and public health people and planners need to actually ally themselves with the data scientists who can actually do the manipulations and scrape the websites and get that data.
So this is kind of a follow-up question to from the introductory conversation. I heard the question, but I don't think I heard the answer. So it's expensive to generate this data. It does take away time, if you're a social service agency or something, to generate this data instead of helping somebody, and it costs money as well. How do you prevent that from interfering with the work on the ground?
So all of the data, so some data is expensive to generate, but all the examples I gave were data sources that are available because agencies are already collecting that data for different purposes to make sure that their staff are reporting to work on time and are serving customers efficiently, for example. That's the operational data. And so I think that there's a large tranche of data that is simply not being used that could be used effectively before we even get to the point of actually having to go out and collect data in a costly way. That's the hidden part of the hidden data that I've been presenting. And my response about advocacy organizations is I think that it's essential that they use data to be more effective at their job, at their mission. And so, for example, if you are a frontline social service provider in an immigrant community, and you're finding that people aren't showing up at your door anymore because they're scared of getting deported, you need to be able to have data to show that this is happening and that there needs to be policy change to prevent people from the fear of deportation. A different identification card, assurances by the city that it's a sanctuary city, all of those kinds of policy changes that can happen. So I would push back on your question by saying you can't really be efficient and effective and be helping people to the extent you could if you're not using data effectively, even if you're a nonprofit.
Probably time for one more. Anybody? Okay.
Hi there. My background is in, I'm a professional chef with some academic background as well, and I have tons of questions for you, but one specifically related to the school, food and school program that you mentioned. And I'm curious whether you have any specific data on the actual facilities in which the food is produced for the, across the city, whether it's on location or off location, in some cases being distributed to schools, and consequently the time differences you mentioned about lunch times, and also whether you have any per student budget per day that is allotted to the students. Is it equitable across the city, or does it vary?
The last question is it's $2.71 per meal served, and that covers operational costs as well as the food. And that's the budget that USDA provides to schools. Private schools may supplement that, but public schools, that's what they get. There isn't data available. I mean, there is data from the Department of Ed. You'd have to file a Freedom of Information Law request to get it. And I didn't mention that. That's another tool to get free data. But so there's no data on exactly where every item is purchased from and how it's delivered and which schools have scratch cooking facilities or just reheat food. But there is data that was required by the New York City Council on whether the school has a separate cafeteria or not, or whether they're using a gymnasium or other rooms to serve the meals in. And that is eye-opening because a lot of schools actually don't have the space to serve meals. And the City Council required data on the hours that kids eat lunch. So that's now publicly available. And they did that deliberately because their constituents were telling them that their kids were eating lunch at 10 a.m. And city councilors feel that they can easily legislate for more data because it doesn't technically cost the agency anymore, and they don't have to actually have a budget allocation for that legislation, but they can show their constituents that they're actually making progress in creating change by arming their constituents with the data that then they can go to the principal and complain about. So that, does that answer a couple of your questions? Yeah. Really important questions. And we do have the cafeteria inspection data, which shows whether there are mechanical or other kinds of violations in the cafeteria that are,
Just from a quality of food perspective, you can see where students may not want to go to the cafeteria. It's, pretty marginal product.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So this has been fantastic. Nevin, do you have any concluding, oh, you one more
Sorry,
question?
very
Okay.
very quickly, sorry, just we're ending on school eating environments, which is of interest to me. So you've mentioned the 10 a.m. thing a couple times and also settings where they've eaten. Is the 10 a.m. an effort to do a staggered lunch so that the students are eating in better settings? Or?
No, if you have 3,000 kids in one small cafeteria, that's the only way you can fit them in.
So it is a staggered, sorry.
Yeah. And schools don't get reimbursed unless kids are served lunch. And so even if the kids aren't hungry enough to eat the food, the schools would rather serve them and get reimbursed than not.
So it's a site issue then, ultimately.
It's a fiscal issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is time to close. So do you have any kind of concluding things you want to say based on the questions and who's in the room? And
I think the questions of cost and complexity are really important, and you raised that earlier today. And I'm not making light of how difficult it is to actually access and use data. My only response is that we need to actually figure out ways to work together and find the skills that are needed to use this data. And they're all around. Just like the data are hidden in plain sight, there are data nerds in every campus around the country and in lots of places you wouldn't expect.
and we need multiple Nevin Cohens to make it accessible. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have about another half an hour, and there's some refreshments outside, so we invite you to join in that if you have time, and perhaps have a chat with Barbara or Nevin, and anybody else in the room, obviously. And I'd just like to say thanks again for making the trek, Nevin. It was incredibly enriching to find out about your work and to see how we can really use data in really creative ways to move the needle on social and eco-activism. So I really thank you.
Thank you.